The words sliced through the air like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. I stood frozen in the living room, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the coffee table for support. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not to us. Jenny, how could you? Richard's voice was laced with disappointment and anger. My mother has done nothing but welcome you into our home, and this is how you repay her? I turned to face my husband, searching his eyes for any sign of the man I'd fallen in love with. But all I saw was a stranger, his face contorted with rage. Richard, please, I whispered, my voice barely audible. You don't understand. I would never. Save it, Jenny, Patricia interrupted, her voice dripping with venom. She stood beside Richard, her hand resting possessively on his arm. We've seen how you've been treating me. The constant criticism, the snide remarks, the way you exclude me from family decisions. I shook my head vehemently, struggling to find the words to defend myself. That's not true. Patricia, you know that's not true. Richard stepped forward, his jaw clenched. I've seen it with my own eyes, Jenny. The way you roll your eyes when Mom speaks, how you conveniently forget to include her in our plans. It stops now. My mind raced, trying to make sense of their accusations. How had everything gone so wrong? Just yesterday, we were laughing over dinner, sharing stories, and making plans for the future. And now, I don't understand, I said, my voice cracking. Richard, we've always been honest with each other. You know me. You know I would never intentionally hurt anyone, especially your mother. Patricia let out a dramatic sigh. Oh, spare us the innocent act, Jenny. We're not blind. You've been trying to drive a wedge between Richard and me since day one. I turned to Richard, desperation clawing at my chest. Honey, please, you have to believe me. I love you. I love our family. Why would I do anything to jeopardize that? For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in Richard's eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a steely resolve. I'm sorry, Jenny, but I can't ignore what I've seen. Mom's right. This has to stop. The room began to spin, and I felt my knees buckle. This couldn't be happening. How had my perfect life crumbled so quickly? What are you saying? I managed to choke out. Richard's voice was cold, detached. I think it's best if you leave for a while. Give us all some space to think things through. The words hit me like a physical blow. Leave. Richard, this is our home. Where am I supposed to go? Patricia's lips curled into a triumphant smile. I'm sure you'll figure something out, dear. You've always been so resourceful. I looked from Richard to Patricia, searching for any sign of compassion, any hint that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But their faces remained impassive, united against me. With shaking hands, I reached for my purse. I need some air. I can't breathe. As I stumbled towards the door, I heard Patricia's voice behind me. Take all the time you need, Jenny. We'll be here when you're ready to apologize. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. I leaned against the wall, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. How had my life fallen apart so completely in the span of a single conversation? As I made my way down the stairs, my phone buzzed in my pocket. With trembling fingers, I pulled it out, hoping against hope to see Richard's name on the screen. Instead, I saw a text from my mother, Mary. Honey, is everything okay? I have a strange feeling. Call me if you need anything. I clutched the phone to my chest, a lifeline in the storm that had become my life. As I stepped out into the cool evening air, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. As I sat in my mother's kitchen, clutching a steaming mug of tea, the memories of happier times with Richard flooded my mind. The stark contrast between then and now made my heart ache. Jenny, sweetheart, my mother's gentle voice broke through my reverie. You haven't touched your tea. It's getting cold. I blinked, forcing myself back to the present. Sorry, Mom. I was just remembering. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Tell me about it. Sometimes talking helps. I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out. It wasn't always like this. You know, Richard and I, we were so happy once. I closed my eyes, transported back to our wedding day. The way Richard looked at me as I walked down the aisle, his eyes shining with love and promise. Our first dance, his arms strong and sure around me as we swayed to our favorite song. We were unstoppable, I said, a wistful smile tugging at my lips. Remember how we'd stay up all night, talking about our dreams? the house we'd build, the family we'd have. My mother nodded, her eyes soft with understanding. You two were quite the pair, so full of hope and love. The memory shifted, and suddenly I was reliving our first anniversary. Richard had surprised me with a picnic in the park where we'd had our first date. We'd laughed and fed each other strawberries, making plans for the future between kisses. It all changed when we moved in with Patricia, I said, my voice hardening. At first it seemed like such a good idea. Help her out, save money for our own place, but then I trailed off. Remembering the day, everything started to unravel. It had been a Sunday morning, barely a month after we'd moved in. I was making breakfast, humming to myself, when Patricia walked in. "Oh, Jenny," she'd said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Is that how you scramble eggs? No wonder Richard's been looking so thin lately." I'd brushed it off at first, laughing awkwardly. But as the weeks went by, the comments became more frequent, more pointed. Nothing I did was ever good enough. I tried to talk to Richard about it, I told my mother, frustration creeping into my voice. But he always defended her, said I was being too sensitive, that it was just her way of showing she cared. My mother's brow furrowed. "And you never told me any of this was happening?" I shook my head, shame washing over me. I thought I could handle it. I didn't want to worry you. Just then my phone buzzed, a text from Richard. My heart leapt, hope surging through me. Maybe he'd realized his mistake, maybe he was ready to listen. But as I read the message, that hope crumbled to dust. "Jenny, I need you to come back and apologize to Mom. This has gone on long enough." I stared at the screen, disbelief turning to anger. "He wants me to apologize," I said, my voice shaking. "After everything she's done, after the way they treated me, he wants me to apologize." My mother's face hardened. "Oh, honey, I think it's time we had a serious talk about what's been going on in that house." As I began to recount the full extent of Patricia's behavior, the constant criticism, the subtle manipulations, the way she'd slowly but surely driven a wedge between Richard and me, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and confusion were still there, but alongside them, a new emotion was taking root. Determination. "Mom," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months, "I think I need a lawyer." My mother nodded, a fierce pride in her eyes. "That's my girl. It's time to fight back." As I picked up my phone to make the call, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the broken, confused person who'd fled her home yesterday. This woman had fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. Patricia and Richard had no idea what was coming. I stood in Patricia's immaculate kitchen, my hands submerged in soapy water as I scrubbed at a stubborn pot. The sound of the front door opening made me tense, but I forced myself to keep working. It was probably just Richard coming home from work. "Jenny?" Patricia's shrill voice called out. "Where are you?" I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and plastered on a smile. "In the kitchen, Patricia." She bustled in, her eyes immediately scanning the room. "Oh, you're doing the dishes. How quaint." I bit my tongue, focusing on the task at hand, just trying to keep things tidy. Patricia moved closer, peering over my shoulder. You know, dear, there's a certain technique to getting those pots really clean. Here, let me show you." Before I could protest, she shouldered me aside, plunging her hands into the water. "You see, you need to use a bit more elbow grease, like this." I watched as she scrubbed vigorously, water splashing onto my shirt. "I think I had it under control, Patricia," she laughed, a high, tinkling sound that set my teeth on edge. "Oh, Jenny, there's no shame in admitting you need help. After all, not everyone grows up learning proper housekeeping skills." The implication in her words was clear, and I felt my cheeks burn. "I'm perfectly capable of cleaning a pot, thank you." Patricia turned to me, her eyes wide with mock innocence. "Of course you are, dear. I'm just trying to help. After all, I want my son to have a comfortable home." I opened my mouth to retort, but the words died on my lips as Richard walked in. "Hey, what's going on in here?" Patricia's demeanor changed instantly. "Oh, Richard, I was just showing Jenny a few housekeeping tips. You know how I love to pass on my knowledge." Richard smiled, oblivious to the tension in the room. "That's great, Mom. Jenny's lucky to have you to learn from." I felt something snap inside me. "Actually, Richard, your mother was just about to start on dinner," Patricia interrupted smoothly. "Jenny, why don't you finish up those dishes while Richard and I catch up?" As they left the kitchen, arm in arm, I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white. This couldn't go on. I had to say something. Later that evening, I found Richard alone in our bedroom. "Can we talk?" He looked up from his phone, frowning slightly. "Sure. What's up?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "It's about your mother. I think there's been some misunderstandings between us." Richard's frown deepened. "What do you mean?" "Well, sometimes the things she says, they come across as a bit critical." He sighed, shaking his head. "Jenny, we've been over this. Mom's just trying to help. She doesn't mean anything by it." "But Richard, today in the kitchen—" "Look," he cut me off, his voice tinged with frustration. "I know it's an adjustment living with Mom, but she's family. Well, can't you just try a little harder to get along?" I felt like I'd been slapped. "Try harder?" "Richard, I've been trying. But your mother—" "Enough." Richard's voice was sharp. "I'm tired of hearing you complain about Mom. She's been nothing but kind to you. Maybe you're the one with the problem." Tears stung my eyes as I stared at my husband, this man I barely recognized anymore. "How can you say that? Don't you see what's happening?" But Richard had already turned away, his attention back on his phone. "I think you need to do some serious thinking, Jenny, about your attitude and about this family." I stumbled out of the room, my mind reeling. As I passed Patricia's door, I heard her voice, low and smug. "I told you, Richard, she's never been good enough for you." In that moment, something inside me hardened. This wasn't just about dishes or housekeeping tips anymore. This was war, and I was done playing nice. I paced the length of our bedroom, my mind racing. The conversation with Richard last night had left me feeling more alone than ever. How could I make him see the truth about his mother? I needed a plan. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. "Jenny, are you decent?" Patricia's saccharine voice called out. I gritted my teeth. "Come in, Patricia." She glided into the room, a picture of innocence in her floral dress. "I thought we could have a little chat, just us girls." "About what?" I asked, wary of her sudden friendliness. Patricia perched on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirt. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion with Richard last night. I think there's been a misunderstanding." I crossed my arms, steeling myself. "Is that so?" "Oh, yes," she nodded emphatically. "You see, I only want what's best for both of you. Richard's happiness is my top priority." "And what about my happiness?" I countered. Patricia's eyes narrowed for a split second before her smile returned. "Of course, dear. That's why I think it's time we cleared the air. Why don't you tell me what's really bothering you?" I took a deep breath. This was my chance. "Patricia, I feel like you're constantly criticizing me, the way you talk about my housekeeping, my cooking." "Oh, Jenny," she interrupted, her voice dripping with false concern. "I had no idea you felt that way. I was only trying to help. You know, not everyone has the advantage of a proper upbringing." Her words stung, but I pressed on. "It's not just that. The way you interfere in our marriage, always pulling Richard aside for private conversations." "Now, wait just a minute." Patricia's voice hardened. "Are you accusing me of coming between you and my son? After everything I've done for you both?" "That's not what I think I've heard enough." She stood abruptly. I was willing to extend an olive branch, but clearly you're determined to paint me as the villain. Just then, Richard appeared in the doorway. "What's going on?" I heard raised voices. Patricia's demeanor changed instantly, her eyes welling with tears. "Oh, Richard, I was just trying to make peace with Jenny, but she accused me of trying to ruin your marriage." Richard's face darkened as he turned to me. "Is this true, Jenny?" I felt trapped, cornered by their united front. "No, I mean yes, but not like that. I was trying to explain how I felt." "How you felt?" Richard's voice rose. "How about how my mother feels being attacked in her own home?" "Richard, please," I pleaded. "Just listen to me for once. Your mother—" "That's enough!" he roared. "I've had it with your constant complaints about Mom. She's bent over backward to welcome you into this family, and this is how you repay her." Patricia sniffled dramatically. "It's all right, Richard. I'm sure Jenny didn't mean—" "No, Mom," Richard cut her off. "This has gone on long enough." He turned to me, his eyes cold. "Jenny, I think you need to leave. Now." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What? Richard, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," he said, his voice flat. "Pack a bag. I want you out of this house in an hour." As he stormed out, Patricia lingered in the doorway. For a moment her mask slipped, and I saw the triumph in her eyes. "I told you, Jenny. A mother always knows best." With shaking hands, I began to throw clothes into a suitcase. This couldn't be happening. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? As I zipped up the bag, my eyes fell on a framed photo of Richard and me on our wedding day. The happiness in our faces seemed to mock me now. I picked up the frame, my finger tracing Richard's smile. In that moment, I made a decision. This wasn't over. I wouldn't let Patricia win. Somehow, someway, I would fight back and reclaim my life, my marriage, and my dignity. With one last look around the room that had been my sanctuary, I squared my shoulders and walked out, leaving behind the broken pieces of my old life and stepping into an uncertain future. The fluorescent lights of the supermarket buzzed overhead as I wandered aimlessly through the aisles. These brief escapes had become my lifeline, a temporary reprieve from the suffocating atmosphere at home. I lingered in front of the cereal display, not really seeing the colorful boxes, lost in my thoughts. "Jenny, is that you?" I turned to see Sarah, an old friend from college. Her warm smile faltered as she took in my appearance. "Are you okay? You look terrible." I supplied with a weak laugh. "It's been a rough few weeks." Sarah's brow furrowed with concern. "Do you want to grab a coffee? You look like you could use someone to talk to." 20 minutes later, we were seated in a quiet corner of the cafe next door. As I poured out the whole sordid story, Sarah's expression shifted from shock to anger. "Jenny, this is abuse," she said firmly. "What Patricia's doing, how Richard's enabling her. It's not okay." I shook my head, tears pricking at my eyes. "But what can I do? Richard won't listen to me. He thinks I'm the problem." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "You need to get out of there, Jen. This isn't healthy for you." But where would I go? The thought of leaving, of giving up on my marriage, made my chest tighten. "You could stay with me for a while," Sarah offered, "just until you figure things out." As tempting as the offer was, the thought of leaving felt like admitting defeat. "I can't just give up," I said softly. "I love Richard. We built a life together." Sarah's eyes softened with understanding. "I know you do, but sometimes love isn't enough, especially when it's one-sided." Our conversation was interrupted by my phone buzzing. A text from Richard. "Where are you? Mom's waiting to start dinner." I sighed, the weight of reality settling back on my shoulders. "I have to go," I told Sarah, gathering my things. She stood, pulling me into a tight hug. "Promise me you'll think about what I said, and call me anytime, day or night, if you need anything." I nodded, grateful for her support, and headed back to the house that no longer felt like home. As I walked through the front door, Patricia's voice rang out from the kitchen. "Finally! We were beginning to think you'd run off." I bit back a retort, forcing a smile as I entered the room. Richard was setting the table, barely glancing up as I came in. "Sorry I'm late," I said, moving to help with dinner preparations. I ran into an old friend at the store. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Oh, and who might that be?" "Just Sarah from college," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. "We got caught up chatting." Patricia hummed, her tone disapproving. "Well, I suppose some people have time for idle gossip. Others of us prefer to focus on family." I saw Richard tense at her words, waiting for my reaction, but I was too tired to fight. "You're right, Patricia. It won't happen again." As we sat down to eat, the tension in the room was palpable. Richard and Patricia chatted about their day, barely acknowledging my presence. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite gone. "Jenny," Patricia's sharp voice cut through my thoughts. "Aren't you going to eat? After all the effort I put into cooking." I looked up, meeting her challenging gaze. In that moment, something inside me snapped. "Actually, Patricia, I'm not feeling well, if you'll excuse me." I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. Richard finally looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and annoyance. "Jenny, what?" "I said I'm not feeling well," I repeated, my voice stronger now. "I'm going to lie down." As I left the room, I heard Patricia's voice, low and insidious. "You see, Richard, this is what I've been telling you about her attitude." I paused in the hallway, my heart racing. This couldn't go on. Something had to change, and soon. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, Sarah's words echoed in my mind. Maybe it was time to start considering my options. Maybe it was time to fight back. The supermarket's automatic doors slid open, and I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, my arms laden with grocery bags. These shopping trips had become my sanctuary, my brief moments of peace away from the suffocating atmosphere at home. But as I approached the house, a sense of dread settled in my stomach. Something was off. Patricia's car was in the driveway, but so was Richard's. He should have been at work. My heart raced as I fumbled with my keys, pushing open the front door. The silence that greeted me was deafening. "Richard," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty hallway. "Patricia?" As I rounded the corner into the living room, I froze. Richard and Patricia were seated on the couch, their faces grim. Between them, on the coffee table, lay a familiar-looking notebook, my journal. "Jenny," Richard's voice was cold, controlled. "We need to talk." I set the groceries down, my hands shaking. "What's going on?" Patricia spoke up, her voice dripping with false concern. "Sweetheart, we're worried about you. Your behavior lately, well, it's been concerning." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my eyes darting between them and my journal. "Why do you have my private journal?" Richard leaned forward, his face a mask of disappointment. "Jenny, Mom found this while cleaning. The things you've written, they're disturbing." My mind raced. The journal. Of course, I'd been writing down everything, every snide comment, every manipulation, every moment of gaslighting. It was my way of staying sane, of reminding myself I wasn't crazy. "You had no right to read that," I said, my voice trembling with anger and fear. Patricia's eyes widened in mock innocence. "But darling, we were worried. The way you've been portraying us, twisting innocent comments into something sinister, it's not healthy." Richard nodded, his expression hardening. "Jenny, you've accused my mother of emotional abuse. You've written that I'm... what was it? Blind and complicit. How could you think these things about us?" I felt the walls closing in. This was it, the moment everything came crashing down. But as I looked at their faces, something inside me snapped. No more playing nice, no more being the victim. How could I think these things? I repeated, my voice growing stronger. "Because they're true, Richard. Every word in that journal is true. Your mother has been manipulating and belittling me since the day we moved in, and you've been too blind to see it." Patricia gasped dramatically. "Richard, do you hear how she's talking to us? This is exactly what I've been trying to tell you. She's unstable." Richard stood, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Jenny. I won't let you talk about my mother this way. I think it's best if you leave." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Leave? Richard, this is our home. You can't just—" "It's my mother's home," he cut me off. "And clearly you're not happy here. So please, pack your things and go." I looked from Richard to Patricia, searching for any sign of the family I thought I had, but all I saw were two strangers, united against me. With shaking hands, I grabbed my journal from the table. "Fine, I'll go, but this isn't over, Richard. One day you'll see the truth." As I turned to leave, Patricia's voice stopped me. "Oh, Jenny, don't forget to leave your house key. We wouldn't want any unfortunate incidents." I yanked the key off my keyring and tossed it on the table. Without another word, I walked out, slamming the door behind me. Standing on the porch, the weight of what had just happened crashed over me. I was alone, cast out of my own home, my marriage in tatters. But as the initial shock faded, a new emotion took its place: determination. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And Patricia had no idea what she'd unleashed. With one last look at the house that was no longer my home, I pulled out my phone and dialed a familiar number. "Mom? It's me. I need a place to stay." The gentle hum of my mother's sewing machine filled the spare bedroom that had become my sanctuary over the past week. I sat cross-legged on the bed, surrounded by job listings and legal papers, my laptop balanced precariously on my knees. "Jenny?" My mother's voice called from downstairs. "There's someone here to see you." My heart leapt into my throat. Could it be Richard? Had he finally come to his senses? I rushed down the stairs, hope blooming in my chest, only to stop short at the sight of Sarah standing in the entryway. "Hey, stranger," she said, her smile tinged with concern. "Thought I'd check in on you." As we settled in the living room with steaming mugs of tea, I filled Sarah in on everything that had happened since our chance meeting at the supermarket. Her expression darkened with each new revelation. "Jenny, this is serious," she said, setting down her mug. "Have you considered legal action?" I nodded, gesturing to the papers scattered on the coffee table. I've been in touch with a divorce lawyer. She thinks I have a strong case, especially with the journal as evidence. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. Good, but I meant against Patricia. What she's done, it's emotional abuse. You could press charges. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I don't know, Sarah. That seems so final. Isn't that what you want? She asked gently. To be free of her influence? Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. A text from Richard. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the cafe near Mom's house tomorrow at 2? My hands shook as I showed Sarah the message. What do you think? Should I go? She frowned, considering. It could be a trap. Patricia might have put him up to this. Or it could be my chance to make him see the truth, I countered, hope flaring in my chest. Sarah sighed, squeezing my hand. Just be careful, okay? And call me the second you're done. The next day, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, my nerves on edge. As I sipped my latte, I rehearsed what I wanted to say, how I would make Richard understand. At exactly 2 p.m., the bell above the door chimed. I looked up, my heart pounding, to see Richard walk in. But he wasn't alone. Patricia trailed behind him, her face a mask of concern. My stomach dropped. What is she doing here? I demanded as they approached my table. Richard at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Jenny, please. Mom's worried about you. We both are. Patricia nodded, her eyes brimming with fake tears. Sweetheart, we just want to help. This behavior, these accusations, it's not like you. I felt the walls closing in, my carefully prepared speech crumbling to dust. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Richard. Can't you see what she's doing? He shook his head, frustration etched on his face. All I see is my wife pushing away the people who love her. Jenny, please, come home. We can work this out. For a moment, I wavered. The thought of going home, of things going back to normal, was tempting, but then I caught sight of the triumphant gleam in Patricia's eyes, and my resolve hardened. No, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I won't come back to that toxic environment. Richard, I love you, but I can't live like that anymore. Patricia's mask slipped, her voice turning cold. You ungrateful little. That's enough, Mom, Richard interrupted, looking torn. He turned to me, his eyes pleading. Jenny, please, don't do this. I stood, gathering my things. I'm sorry, Richard, but I've made my decision. You'll be hearing from my lawyer. As I walked out of the cafe, I heard Patricia's voice behind me. You'll regret this, Jenny. No one leaves this family without consequences. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I kept walking. With each step I felt stronger, more determined. This wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. Back at my mother's house, I pulled out my phone and dialed my lawyer's number. It's Jenny, I said when she answered. I'm ready to move forward with everything, all of it. As I hung up, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. The woman staring back at me wasn't the broken, confused person who'd fled her home a week ago. This woman had fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. Patricia wanted consequences. Fine. She was about to learn that I could give as good as I got. I stood on the doorstep of Patricia's house, my heart pounding, but my resolve unshakable. The manila envelope in my hand felt heavy with the weight of its contents. Divorce papers, copies of my journal entries, and a restraining order against Patricia. This was it, the moment of truth. I rang the doorbell, steeling myself for what was to come. The door swung open, revealing Richard's surprised face. Jenny, what are you doing here? We need to talk, I said, my voice steady. All of us. Patricia appeared behind him, her eyes narrowing at the sight of me. You're not welcome here anymore. I held up the envelope. Trust me, you'll want to hear what I have to say. Reluctantly, they let me in. As we gathered in the living room, the same room where my world had fallen apart weeks ago, I felt a surge of strength. This time, I was in control. I'll make this quick, I began, pulling out the papers. Richard, these are divorce papers. I'm not asking for much, just what's fair. And this, I held up my journal, is evidence of the emotional abuse I've endured in this house. Patricia scoffed. Abuse? Don't be ridiculous. It's all here, Patricia. Every snide comment, every manipulation, every time you turned Richard against me. And I have witnesses. Friends who saw what was happening. Richard's face paled as he flipped through the pages. Jenny, I had no idea. Of course you didn't, I said softly. You didn't want to see it. But I'm done being silent. I'm done being the victim. Patricia's mask of innocence slipped, revealing the anger beneath. You ungrateful little witch, after everything we've done for you. Enough, Mom, Richard interrupted, his voice sharp. He turned to me, his eyes filled with regret. Jenny, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the love we once shared, but I knew it was too late. I'm sorry too, Richard, but this is how it has to be. I turned to Patricia, meeting her glare with a calm gaze. And this is for you, a restraining order. You're to have no contact with me, directly or through others. Patricia's face contorted with rage. You can't do this! Richard, tell her she can't do this! But Richard remained silent, still staring at the journal in his hands. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past months lifting from my shoulders. It's done, Patricia. You no longer have any power over me. As I turned to leave, Richard called out. Jenny, wait. Is there any chance we could work this out? I paused at the door, looking back at the man I once thought I'd spend my life with. I'm sorry, Richard, but some things can't be undone. I hope one day you'll understand why I had to do this. With that, I walked out, closing the door on that chapter of my life. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in years. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. How did it go? Are you okay? I smiled, typing back. It's done. I'm more than okay. I'm free. As I drove away, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was stronger, wiser, and more resilient than I'd ever been. Patricia had tried to break me, but instead, she'd forged me into something unbreakable. I thought about the future stretching out before me. Uncertain, yes, but full of possibilities. I had my freedom, my self-respect, and a support system of friends and family who truly loved me. For the first time in months, I laughed out loud, joy bubbling up from deep within. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, my beginning, and I couldn't wait to see what came next. As I pulled into my mother's driveway, I saw her waiting on the porch, concern etched on her face. I stepped out of the car, envelope in hand, and gave her a triumphant smile. It's over, Mom, I said, feeling lighter than air. I did it. She pulled me into a fierce hug, and I felt the last of my doubts melt away. I was home, I was loved, and I was finally truly free. The road ahead might be challenging, but I was ready. Because now I knew the truth. I was stronger than any storm life could throw my way, and that knowledge, that was worth everything I'd been through.